It was a quiet morning, just like any other. The usual hum of the courthouse filled the air as people shuffled in and out, getting ready for their day in the heart of the justice system. But for two people in particular, this day was anything but ordinary. In fact, it was about to change their lives forever. One of them was a black teenager, unassuming and kind-hearted, with the kind of humility that made him stand out in a world that often overlooked young people like him. The other was a cop, doing his usual rounds, looking for trouble where there wasn't any. Little did he know he was about to make a mistake that could cost him everything. The scene unfolds with a seemingly simple act of kindness. The young black man, sitting quietly on a bench, notices a pregnant white woman entering the crowded courtroom. She looks tired, her heavy belly a clear sign of her struggle to stand for too long. Without hesitation, he stands up and offers her his seat. It's a small gesture, but one that speaks volumes about who he is. The woman, grateful for the kindness, smiles and accepts, never imagining that this brief moment of civility would lead to something far more extraordinary than either of them could have anticipated. But as fate would have it, that same cop, whose attention had been wandering, notices the interaction. His gaze shifts between the young man and the pregnant woman, and something about it doesn't sit right with him. Without thinking, he walks up to the teenager, tapping him on the shoulder. The cop's voice is sharp as he demands an explanation, assuming there's more to the situation than meets the eye. In his mind, this is no simple act of kindness. No, there must be something suspicious going on. After all, it's just a black teenager offering a white woman a seat in a place where power dynamics often fuel tension. But what the cop doesn't know is that this young man, who looks like just another kid trying to get through the day, is not just anyone. He's not the teenager he thinks he is. In fact, he's someone who could easily turn this whole courthouse into a whirlwind of chaos with just one phone call. Unbeknownst to the officer, the teenager he's confronting is the CIA chief, a man whose identity is top secret, someone with connections and influence that stretch far beyond this courtroom. This wasn't just a random encounter. It was about to become a moment of reckoning for everyone involved. The cop's hand moves instinctively, perhaps to assert control, but the second it makes contact with the young man, everything changes. Time seems to freeze for a moment, and the courtroom holds its breath. The young man, calm and collected, doesn't react immediately. Instead, he looks the cop in the eye, his expression unreadable. It's not the kind of look you expect from a teenager, especially one who's been accosted by an authority figure. But in that brief second, it's clear that he knows something the cop doesn't. And that, my friends, is where the story begins to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. As the tension rises, the pregnant woman who had been the subject of the young man's kindness watches the scene play out. Her curiosity grows, and a few moments later, she writes something on a piece of paper, folding it carefully and handing it back to him. What's in the note? What does it say? She, too, is about to unknowingly play a role in the unfolding drama. Now, the courtroom is buzzing with whispers. Some of the onlookers are unsure what to make of the situation, while others, like the cop, are only getting more agitated. The young man, however, remains calm and poised. He simply stands there, knowing that he can't let this moment pass without something significant happening. He's ready to reveal the truth, but the timing must be perfect. And he knows that the perfect moment is almost here. But as the story unfolds, something incredible happens. A twist in the tale is about to change everything. The cop, frustrated by the lack of answers and still feeling like he's losing control, starts to escalate the situation. Yet, the young man remains unfazed. He's not just any teenager. He's far more than that. His eyes lock on the officers, and suddenly, the entire room seems to grow still. Just then, the moment of truth arrives. The young man finally speaks, his voice steady, his words carrying weight far beyond what anyone in the room could imagine. The cop freezes, not knowing what to do next. The air thickens with uncertainty. Who is this teenager? What does he know? What will happen next? And before anyone can fully process what's happening, the pregnant woman, who had been sitting quietly and observing everything, slips him a note, one that will change everything. What's in the note? What does it say? You won't believe the incredible twist that's coming next. Stay tuned, because you're about to witness a story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. The plot is thickening, and the truth is about to come out in ways no one could have foreseen. Don't go anywhere, this is just the beginning. The room was still, the tension palpable, as everyone watched the scene unfold in front of them. The cop stood there, his hand still hovering in the air, uncertain of what to do next. He wasn't used to feeling like this. He had been a police officer long enough to know how to handle situations with force, with authority, but this was different. The young man in front of him wasn't acting like anyone he had ever encountered before. Most teenagers would have panicked or reacted in anger, but this one just stood there, calm and almost eerily composed. The cop's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was going on. He had seen a lot in his career, but something about this moment didn't sit right with him. It was like there was something he was missing, some detail he wasn't understanding. The way the teenager's eyes locked with his, it wasn't the look of a scared kid. It was something deeper, something much more unsettling. The cop had seen that look before, but never from someone who appeared so ordinary. The pregnant woman, who had been sitting quietly, now fidgeted in her seat. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. What had she just witnessed? The young man offering his seat had seemed so kind, so genuine, but now she wasn't so sure. What had triggered the officer's reaction? Why had he approached the teenager so aggressively? She tried to make sense of the scene, but the more she thought about it, the more confused she became. The note she had written earlier, now folded neatly and handed over, was her way of reaching out. She had no idea what was really going on, but she sensed that something significant was about to happen. Her intuition told her that this wasn't just some random confrontation. There was something bigger at play here, something that neither she nor anyone else in that room could fully grasp yet. As she watched the young man, her curiosity deepened. Who was he really? The more she looked at him, the more she felt like she was missing something important. She had handed him the note because she felt compelled to do so, but she hadn't expected the look in his eyes when he accepted it. There was something about the way he took it, the way he held it for just a moment longer than necessary. It was almost as if he was acknowledging something that went beyond the ordinary, beyond the surface of what anyone else could see. The cop, meanwhile, was growing more agitated. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, and he didn't like it. He was used to being the one in control, the one who people listened to. But here, now, in this moment, he felt like the situation was slipping out of his hands. His gaze flickered between the teenager and the rest of the people in the room, looking for any sign that might explain what was happening. "What's your name, kid?" the officer barked, his voice sharp and demanding. The young man didn't flinch. He simply looked back at the cop, his face a picture of calm. "I'm not going to ask you again." The cop pressed, his tone growing more aggressive. For a split second, the room held its breath. The young man's lips parted, but before he could say anything, the sound of footsteps echoed from the back of the courtroom. The door creaked open, and the judge walked in. The tension was broken, but only for a moment. Everyone's attention shifted momentarily to the judge as she made her way to the bench, but the undercurrent of tension remained. The cop hesitated, clearly annoyed at the interruption. He shot a final, lingering glance at the teenager before turning away to take his seat. But as he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted. This wasn't the end. Far from it. The pregnant woman watched the cop take a seat, then turned her attention back to the teenager. She still couldn't understand what had just happened. Why had the cop reacted that way? She had been present for many courtroom dramas, but nothing like this. And then there was the teenager. The way he had handled the situation, it was as though he had been in control the whole time, even though he had never once raised his voice. She couldn't help but glance at the note she had handed him. What had compelled her to write it in the first place? The more she thought about it, the more she realized it hadn't been a random act. She had felt something in the air, a kind of energy that told her this was no ordinary day. This was no ordinary teenager. And something told her that the note she had written might be the key to understanding it all. As the judge settled into her seat and the proceedings began, the young man slipped the folded note into his pocket, never once looking at it. He was calm, composed, too composed for a teenager. There was something about him that didn't fit, something about the way he carried himself. It wasn't just the quiet confidence, but the way he seemed to exist in a world that was far removed from the chaos around him. And yet, despite his calm demeanor, there was a sense of unease growing within him. He knew that what had just happened with the cop wasn't going to be the end of it. In fact, it was just the beginning. There were forces at play here, forces that went beyond what anyone in the room could possibly understand. He had known it for a long time, but now the situation was about to escalate. He could feel it in his bones. The pregnant woman, still puzzled by the interaction, shifted in her seat. She tried to focus on the proceedings, but her mind kept drifting back to the teenager. There was something about him, something that didn't add up. Her instincts were telling her that there was more to him than met the eye. She couldn't explain why, but she had to know more. The air in the courtroom grew heavy again, the kind of weight that settles on you when you know something is about to happen but you're not sure when. The judge, who had been focused on the case in front of her, looked up from the paperwork for just a moment, her gaze flicking across the room. She stopped on the young man for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for him to notice. There was a brief, silent exchange, one that no one else saw but both of them felt. And then, just like that, it was over. The judge's eyes moved away, and the proceedings continued. But the tension remained. What was going to happen next? What was going to unfold in this courtroom? As the young man sat there, still as a statue, his mind raced. The cop had made a mistake. A dangerous one. And while it wasn't time to reveal who he truly was, the moment was coming. He could feel it. He knew that the truth would soon come to light, and when it did, everything would change. But for now, all he could do was wait. The game had only just begun. The courtroom was filled with an unsettling silence, the kind that makes you feel like you're waiting for something inevitable, but you don't know exactly what. The judge's voice cut through the stillness, but it did little to break the heavy air. The young man, still calm and collected, sat in his seat, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't fully express. He was trying to focus on the case at hand, but the events of the morning, his interaction with the cop, the strange note from the pregnant woman, the lingering feeling of something about to break, had taken hold of him. He glanced over at the officer, who had returned to his seat, but his eyes were no longer filled with the casual arrogance that the young man had seen earlier. Now, the officer was on edge, his gaze flicking back and forth as if he was trying to make sense of something that didn't quite add up. The cop's hand kept rubbing the back of his neck, and his eyes never seemed to settle. There was a discomfort in his posture, a telltale sign that he was struggling with his own thoughts. He had never expected the teenager to react the way he did, so calm, so unbothered. Most kids would have shouted, tried to defend themselves, maybe even get angry. But this teenager, he had simply stood there, not backing down, not showing any fear. The cop didn't understand it. In his mind, the situation had been clear. A kid, a black teenager, showing respect to a white woman. It didn't sit right with him. It was too ideal, too perfect. People like him didn't do things like that. It made him uncomfortable, made him question everything he thought he knew about this world. And then the moment of hesitation, the look in the teenager's eyes. It was as if the kid had been saying, "I know something you don't, and you're about to find out what that is." That thought made the cop shiver. He couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was going on than he could understand. Across the room, the pregnant woman was still lost in thought. She hadn't forgotten about the note she had given the young man. She hadn't expected him to do anything with it, not really. It had simply been an impulse, a quiet feeling that told her to do it. But now, with everything that had happened, she couldn't help but wonder if that note might have more significance than she had thought. She couldn't help but look back at him, trying to decipher his expression, trying to read his face for some clue. What did he know? Who was he really? There was an odd sense of familiarity in the way he carried himself. It was as though he was from a different world entirely, a world that she couldn't quite access. Her mind drifted back to her own life, to the path that had led her here. She wasn't from a privileged background. She knew struggle. She understood what it meant to fight for every step forward. But this moment, this odd, tension-filled moment, felt like something was shifting. It was like fate had pulled her into the story, even though she hadn't expected it. The young man was at the center of it all, and somehow, she felt connected to him in a way she couldn't explain. There was a reason she had chosen to sit in that seat today. There was a reason she had noticed him. In the far corner of the room, a journalist, observing everything from behind a notepad, was also trying to make sense of the scene. He had been in enough courtrooms to know when something didn't feel right, and everything about this moment screamed suspicious. The officer's aggressive approach to the teenager's unshakable composure, the pregnant woman's strange interaction with him, something was off. The journalist's instincts told him that he was witnessing a story unfolding right before his eyes, something bigger than just a random confrontation. But what was it? What was the connection between these people? He scribbled down a few notes, his pen moving rapidly across the paper, but his mind was elsewhere. As the proceedings dragged on, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier, like a storm about to break. Everyone in the room felt the tension, but no one knew how to address it. The young man, who had been silent through the whole ordeal, finally shifted in his seat, the soft sound of his movement catching the attention of those around him. He took a deep breath, his fingers grazing the note in his pocket. He wasn't ready yet. Not yet. But soon. Soon, he would have to take action. The time was approaching when everything would come crashing down, and there would be no going back. What had started as an innocent act of kindness, offering a seat to a pregnant woman, was now spiraling into something much larger. It was a catalyst, a spark, and soon, the fire would spread. The young man knew that the officer wouldn't let this go. His pride had been hurt, and he would do whatever it took to regain control. But the young man had a secret. He wasn't just any teenager. And the people in this room had no idea just how far-reaching his connections were. As the judge called for a short recess, the courtroom emptied out briefly, and people milled about in hushed conversations. The officer, clearly agitated, stepped outside the room for a moment. The pregnant woman, still seated, watched him go, and then turned her eyes back to the teenager. It was almost as if time itself had slowed down for just a moment. She studied him, trying to piece together the puzzle that was quickly forming in her mind. There was something about him that defied the usual expectations. Something that told her he was important, far more important than he seemed. The journalist approached her, sensing an opportunity to gain insight into the story. "Did you see what happened with the officer?" he asked, his voice low, cautious. She nodded, her eyes flickering toward the door the officer had just exited. "I don't know," she whispered. "There's something off about all of it. Something's not right." He studied her for a moment, then glanced back at the teenager. "Do you know him? Do you think he's involved in all this?" She hesitated, her thoughts swirling. "I'm not sure, but I think he's more than he lets on. I don't know what it is, but I feel like this is bigger than just a small thing between a cop and a kid." The journalist nodded, his mind working furiously to connect the dots. He could feel the weight of the moment, the pulse of something important just beneath the surface. "We need to keep an eye on him," he said, before slipping away to gather more information. Meanwhile, the young man remained in his seat, his thoughts turning to what was next. The officer had made his move, and now it was his turn. But he couldn't act too soon. He needed to wait for the right moment, the right words. The truth would come out soon enough, and when it did, nothing in that courtroom, nothing in the world, would be the same. But for now, he had to be patient. The game was far from over. The recess felt endless. The tension in the courtroom was thick, as if it had a life of its own, curling into every corner of the room and making it hard to breathe. People spoke in hushed tones, but even their murmurs seemed to echo, amplifying the sense that something big was on the verge of happening. The young man sat motionless in his seat, his eyes focused on the floor in front of him. He didn't flinch when someone brushed past him, didn't respond when the journalist's gaze lingered a moment too long. His mind, however, was racing, calculating. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, the pressure building. He was so close. So close to what, though? He couldn't help but wonder. Outside the courtroom, the officer was pacing back and forth. His frustration was palpable, his fists clenching and unclenching with every step. He had made a huge misstep by confronting the young man, but now it was too late. The seeds of doubt had been planted. He couldn't just walk away from this. He had to get to the bottom of who this teenager was, what game he was playing, and why it felt like the world was suddenly slipping out of his control. The officer thought back to the look in the teenager's eyes, those eyes that had told him more than words ever could. It wasn't just a challenge. It was a warning.
The cop knew it now.
That young man was playing a game he didn't understand, but one that was about to come crashing into his life. But who was he really? He hadn't even given a name, and yet it felt as though everything was being set up for some kind of confrontation that neither of them could avoid. Across the room, the pregnant woman was still sitting, her hands now resting on her stomach. She looked at the young man once more, wondering if she had made a mistake by handing him the note. What if he didn't know the significance of it? What if the moment of connection she had felt was nothing more than her own wishful thinking? But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Something was happening. Something that tied them all together, whether they understood it or not. Her gaze flickered to the door where the officer had gone, and then to the group of people gathered at the back of the courtroom. The tension among them was rising, each person keenly aware that something wasn't right. She wasn't the only one feeling it. The journalist had already moved to the far corner, whispering into his phone, no doubt trying to gather information that might explain the odd turn of events. But the more he searched, the more confused he seemed. There were no answers to be found, not in the usual places. The judge had yet to return, and the air hung heavy with anticipation. Everyone knew the proceedings would resume soon, but no one could shake the feeling that when they did, nothing would be the same. It wasn't just the case on the docket anymore. It was the standoff between the officer and the young man. This was the main event now, and no one in that room could look away. Then, as if summoned by the mounting pressure, the doors to the courtroom swung open. The judge returned to her seat, and the room fell silent once more. The pregnant woman couldn't help but notice the shift in the atmosphere. The moment the judge took her place, the entire room seemed to settle into a kind of uneasy calm. But it didn't last long. The officer stepped back into the room, his eyes scanning the crowd for the teenager. He moved deliberately, his steps heavy with intent, as though he were preparing for something far bigger than a mere exchange of words. The young man sat there, his eyes lifting briefly to meet the officer's gaze. There it was again, this unspoken connection between them, as though they both knew something was about to explode. The cop made his way down the aisle, but before he could reach the young man, the sound of a phone vibrating echoed in the otherwise quiet room. The journalist's phone. He glanced at it, his eyes widening. The information he had been waiting for, the final piece to the puzzle, was now in his hands. He looked up, catching the young man's eye for the briefest of moments. The teenager didn't flinch, didn't react. He simply continued to sit, the calm center of a storm that was growing more violent with each passing second. The cop paused at the foot of the young man's seat, staring him down, his fists clenched. "You think you can just play games with me?" the officer growled, his voice low but full of barely contained rage. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The young man didn't move, didn't even acknowledge the threat. His silence was as much a challenge as anything he could have said. And in that silence, a wave of realization hit the officer. He was no longer in control. He had lost control the moment he laid his hands on the teenager. The pregnant woman could feel her heart racing. She didn't know why, but it felt like everything was about to spill over. The tension in the room was unbearable, and she was torn between staying in her seat or standing up, somehow needing to do something, anything to break the deadlock. But there was no room for action now. The moment of reckoning was closing in, and all she could do was watch. The judge cleared her throat, trying to regain order in the room. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "This is not the time or place for personal conflicts. We will proceed with the case now." But the cop didn't seem to hear her. His gaze never left the young man, his body coiled with a kind of energy that was about to snap. And then, the young man finally spoke, his voice as smooth as ever, but with an undercurrent of something far darker. "You have no idea who I am," he said quietly, "and you're about to find out." The words hung in the air, every syllable a weight that pressed down on everyone in the room. The cop's eyes narrowed, but before he could react, the journalist stood up, holding up his phone as though it were a weapon. "I've just confirmed it," he said, his voice shaking. "You don't know who you're dealing with either. This kid? He's not just any teenager. He's the CIA chief." The entire courtroom froze. The pregnant woman's breath caught in her throat. The officer's face went pale. The young man, for the first time, smiled. It was a smile that sent chills down everyone's spine. And just like that, everything changed. The tension that had been building for hours finally exploded. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, but no one knew exactly how the story would end. The courtroom went utterly still. A hushed whisper rippled through the crowd as the journalist's words sank in. The young man, the one everyone had been watching with mounting curiosity, was the CIA chief? The officer's expression went from surprise to disbelief in a matter of seconds, his face draining of color as he processed the bombshell revelation. The pregnant woman, her eyes wide with shock, glanced between the young man and the journalist. She couldn't understand what was happening. How had this all escalated so quickly? The story she thought she had been part of was no longer just about her small act of kindness. She had stumbled into something far deeper, something that could change everything. The officer, still rooted in place, blinked several times, trying to regain his composure. "This is some kind of joke," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He wouldn't believe it. This teenager, this kid who had barely said a word, was the head of one of the most powerful agencies in the world? It didn't make sense. But the young man, calm and unmoving, wasn't offering any reassurance. "I'm not joking," the young man said, his voice colder than it had been all day. "You should have known better than to make an enemy of me." His words were like a spark, igniting a fire that no one in the room was prepared for. The cop's expression twisted with frustration. He wasn't just embarrassed anymore. He was angry. His hands balled into fists, his mind racing with questions that had no immediate answers. But before he could respond, the doors to the courtroom slammed open with a force that made everyone jump. A man in a suit strode in, his presence commanding attention. His sharp eyes scanned the room, landing on the young man with an almost predatory intensity. The officer froze at the sight of him. He knew who this was. The man in the suit wasn't just anyone. He was part of a team known for handling situations like this, situations that involved high-profile individuals like the young man. The officer swallowed hard. What was going on here? He had just realized that this was no ordinary day in court. But this new arrival? This was a curveball he wasn't ready for. "Is there a problem here?" the man in the suit asked, his voice smooth and calculated, almost too calm for the chaotic situation unfolding. The officer's instincts screamed at him to back off, but his pride pushed him forward. "I'm dealing with this," he replied, though his voice was less certain now. The man didn't even glance at him. His eyes stayed locked on the young man. "It's time to go. You know what happens next." His words were blunt, like a signal to everyone in the room that the game was shifting into a new, dangerous phase. The tension that had been building throughout the morning now felt like it was on the verge of snapping. The pregnant woman, unsure of what was happening, clutched the edge of her seat. She could feel the air thick with tension, like the calm before an impending storm. Her hand instinctively moved to her pocket, where the note was still safely tucked. She couldn't help but wonder if it had some connection to all this, if it had some deeper purpose than she had originally thought. But how could she know? The young man finally stood up. His tall, lean frame seemed to fill the space, making the room feel smaller somehow. He didn't acknowledge the man in the suit, didn't flinch when the officer stood in his path. He simply walked past him, as if everything in the world had already been decided, and this moment was just another step in a larger plan. "Wait," the officer barked, his voice now desperate. "I'm not letting you just walk out of here. You're not in charge here." The young man stopped, but only for a moment, his back still turned to the officer. Then, without turning around, he spoke, his voice low and menacing. "You have no idea how much trouble you've just caused. But don't worry. You'll find out soon enough." The words hung in the air like an unspoken promise, and for the first time, The officer felt a shiver of genuine fear crawl up his spine. He had expected to deal with a regular kid, maybe someone trying to pull a fast one or make a statement. But this was different. This was no ordinary teenager. This was someone who could upend everything he knew with just a few words. The man in the suit stepped closer to the young man, his expression unreadable. "We need to leave, now." But as he reached out to place a hand on the young man's shoulder, the sound of a phone ringing shattered the tense silence. It was sharp, jarring, as though it was an alarm signaling the start of something far larger. The journalist, his face pale and wide-eyed, looked down at the phone in his hand. His fingers trembled as he answered, his gaze flicking between the officer, the young man, and the man in the suit. "This is bigger than we thought," the journalist whispered into the phone, his voice shaking. "The information I just got? This kid. He's not just the CIA chief. He's part of something global. Something they've been trying to hide." The words struck like a thunderclap. The officer's knees nearly buckled, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. What was going on? His entire world, which had once been so clearly defined by law and order, now felt like a house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. The pregnant woman's hand flew to her mouth. She had suspected there was more to the young man, but this was something entirely different. The pieces that had seemed so distant, so disconnected, were now falling into place in ways she couldn't quite process. Her mind raced, but she couldn't keep up. And then, just when it seemed like the situation might spiral completely out of control, the doors slammed open once more. A second man entered, taller, more imposing. His presence was magnetic, drawing the attention of everyone in the room, including the man in the suit and the young man. His gaze swept across the room, and when his eyes met the young man's, there was no question that this was a confrontation. "Is everything in place?" the new man asked, his tone cool but commanding. He didn't seem to care about the officer, the journalist, or anyone else in the room. His eyes were fixed solely on the young man. The room seemed to shrink. The stakes had just risen. Whatever game they were all playing, it was far bigger than anyone had realized. And the young man? He finally turned, a small, knowing smile on his face. "It's time," he said, the words carrying the weight of an unspoken truth. "Let's make sure they know who's really in charge." The atmosphere in the courtroom had reached a boiling point. The tension was palpable, as if every person present was holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. The young man, standing tall with an air of confidence, looked at the second man who had just entered. There was no mistaking the gravity of the moment. His face was calm, almost serene, as if everything had already been decided. The man in the suit, who had been with him since the beginning, stood still behind him, observing everything with the cold detachment of someone who had seen it all before. The officer, still grappling with the shocking revelation, was rooted in place, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had just learned. The pregnant woman, who had been pulled into this whirlwind by the smallest of acts, was clutching her seat, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. "You should have stayed out of this," the young man said, his voice cutting through the thick silence like a knife. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but it felt as though he were addressing everyone at once. "But now you're all involved." The officer, unable to take it anymore, stepped forward. His voice shook as he spoke, his frustration finally breaking through. "What is this? Who are you people? What do you want from us?" The young man's smile grew, but there was no warmth in it. "What we want," he said slowly, "is for you to understand that this game, this world, isn't as simple as you think. You think you have control, but in reality, you've been following our rules from the very beginning." The officer recoiled slightly, his mind reeling as the young man's words began to make sense in a twisted sort of way. The man in the suit, still standing silently behind, nodded, his gaze unwavering. Just when it seemed like the young man was about to explain further, the pregnant woman stood up, her voice trembling but determined. "Enough," she cried, her words cutting through the tension in the room. Everyone turned to her, surprised by her outburst. "I don't understand what's going on here, but I know one thing for sure. I don't belong in the middle of this. I didn't ask for this." Her words were like a breath of fresh air in the suffocating room. The young man looked at her for a moment, his gaze softening, but only for a brief second. You were never meant to be in the middle of it. But your kindness, it wasn't lost on me. The man in the suit stepped forward now, his voice low but commanding. We need to go, he said firmly. This isn't the place. We'll deal with them later. But just as the tension seemed to break and the situation was about to be resolved, the unexpected happened. The second man, the imposing figure who had been so silent until now, turned sharply and nodded toward the door. No, he said simply. It's not over yet. Everyone's eyes followed his gaze as the doors to the courtroom slammed open once more. A group of armed men entered, their presence commanding and immediate. They were dressed in black tactical gear, their movements synchronized as they fanned out across the room. For a moment, no one moved. The pregnant woman gasped, her hand instinctively going to her stomach as she instinctively took a step back. The officer, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, was frozen in shock. The young man, still calm, seemed to know exactly what was coming. This is the twist, isn't it? The officer murmured, his voice barely a whisper. The young man turned to him, meeting his gaze with a look that was both chilling and reassuring. You're just a pawn in a much larger game. You've always been. But as the men in black filed into the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted once again. There was a new tension, one far more dangerous and unpredictable. The group wasn't here to take anyone into custody. They were here for something far more sinister. The young man's expression changed. It wasn't fear, no, it was something else. Something darker. He stepped forward, his eyes locking onto the leader of the new group. You shouldn't have come, he said, his voice now laced with an undeniable authority. The leader of the armed men didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, sleek device, holding it out in front of him. We have a problem, he said, his voice cold. It's not just about you anymore. At that moment, the room was filled with the sharp sound of a phone buzzing. The journalist's phone once again. He looked down at the screen, his fingers trembling as he read the message. His eyes widened in disbelief. They know, the journalist said, his voice breaking the sudden silence. They know what's coming. They've been tracking everything. It's a setup. Before anyone could process the shock, the young man turned to the officer, his expression no longer serene but hardened. It's not over yet. You've made your choice. Now we all live with the consequences. A deep, low hum filled the room as the device in the armed man's hand began to glow. The room seemed to spin, and for a split second, everything went black. Then, the sound of shuffling footsteps filled the silence, followed by the sudden pop of a door opening. The second man, the one who had been silent all along, moved swiftly, his hand now gripping something in his pocket. He didn't waste any time. With a sharp motion, he activated something that immediately caused the entire courtroom to flicker, the lights dimming momentarily before returning to full brightness. In that instant, a screen on the far wall flickered to life. A voice, cold and impersonal, boomed from the speakers. The game has changed. We've been watching. The time is now. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, but it wasn't what anyone expected. The officer, the young man, the journalist, the pregnant woman, they were all being pulled into something far bigger than any of them could have imagined. They had unwittingly become pawns in a much larger, much more dangerous game. And the worst part? They still had no idea what the final move would be. The only thing they knew for certain was that it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The room seemed to hold its breath, the hum of tension rising with each passing second. The voices from the screen, cold and detached, echoed in the stunned silence. The game has changed. We've been watching. The time is now. The young man's expression shifted, and for the first time, a flicker of vulnerability showed in his eyes. He knew what was coming. He had prepared for this moment, but that didn't make it any easier. The man in the suit, who had been so composed up until now, glanced at the screen with a grimace, his earlier confidence gone. The armed men in the room remained still, their attention fixed on the leader of the group. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and it felt like the world outside had stopped turning. Even the officer, who had been so focused on his own misplaced authority, now seemed to realize the magnitude of the situation. His posture was less combative, more uncertain. "Is this what you've been working toward?" the officer asked, his voice trembling slightly. The young man turned toward him, his gaze sharp. It was never about control. It was about survival. For all of us. He paused, and for a moment, it seemed like he was about to reveal everything. But then, he simply said, "You were never meant to understand." The officer swallowed hard, his mind racing. The implications of what he had just learned were staggering. The CIA chief, the armed men, the global game that was now unfolding, it all felt like something out of a thriller, except this wasn't fiction. It was real, and it was happening right before his eyes. The pregnant woman, who had been silent throughout the chaos, stepped forward, her hand still clutching the note she had received earlier. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked at the young man, the once innocent teenager who was now at the center of a global conspiracy. What had she gotten herself involved in? All she had wanted was to give up her seat on a crowded train. Yet somehow, she had ended up in the heart of a story far bigger than anything she had ever imagined. The screen flickered again, pulling everyone's attention back to it. The voice, now more urgent, crackled through the speakers. "You've been chosen for a reason. The stakes are higher than you can imagine. Prepare yourselves." The lights flickered once more, and the tension in the room grew unbearable. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something, but what? What was going to happen next? The young man didn't seem surprised, but his demeanor was now serious. The armed men shifted slightly, as if waiting for a signal. The room was about to explode, but no one knew which direction it would go. Then, the young man finally spoke again, his voice low but filled with purpose. "The time for hiding is over. We've been playing by their rules for too long. Now it's our turn." He turned toward the officer, his eyes hardening. "You've been a pawn in this game for too long, but now you have a choice. You can stand with us, or you can stand against us. Either way, the world is about to change. No one can stay neutral anymore." The officer's mind was still reeling, but his instincts kicked in. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, especially when it came to his sense of justice. But this was different. He wasn't sure if he was ready to side with someone who had just revealed himself to be the CIA chief, someone who had been orchestrating a game with global consequences. Before the officer could respond, the man in the suit stepped forward. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "The truth is, no matter what choice you make, you're already part of this. The world is changing, and it's up to you whether you want to control that change or be swept along by it." The young man turned to the pregnant woman, who had been quietly observing the whole exchange. "And as for you," he said, his voice softening, "you didn't just give up your seat on that train. You gave us something far more valuable: hope. People like you, who act out of kindness, are the ones who will shape the future. You'll never fully understand the weight of your actions today, but one day you will." The pregnant woman's eyes widened, her hand still clutching the note. What did he mean by that? Was she truly a part of this much larger story? And if so, what did it mean for her and the child she was carrying? As the room stood in tense silence, the young man's attention shifted. He nodded to the armed men, who immediately began to move toward the door. It was time to go. But as the group made their way out of the courtroom, the young man paused for a moment. He turned back to the officer and the others, his voice carrying one final, resonant warning. "This isn't the end. It's only the beginning." With that, the group left, disappearing into the shadows. The room, once filled with chaos, now stood eerily quiet. The tension in the air lingered, thick with unanswered questions. The officer stood frozen, unsure of what had just transpired. His world had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes. He had witnessed things that defied logic, things he couldn't begin to comprehend. The pregnant woman, still clutching the note, walked slowly to the door, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. She had never expected any of this when she had simply decided to give up her seat. But as she walked out into the bright sunlight, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life, her child's life, was about to take a dramatic turn. The world outside had changed, and she, like everyone else in that room, was now part of something much bigger than herself. The officer stood there, watching them leave, his thoughts a jumble of confusion and realization. The final twist had been laid bare, but the game was far from over. As the days passed and the events of that courtroom continued to unfold across the world, the officer would find himself drawn deeper into a web he could never have imagined. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of anyone in that room, a new chapter was beginning. A chapter that would challenge everything they thought they knew about power, control, and the future. The young man's words echoed in the officer's mind as the world around him began to shift. The time for hiding is over. We've been playing by their rules for too long.